So he said, he has to read the whole opening thing. He says, can you come back and do it?
Jake Reiner truly believed this Christmas would finally bring him home, not just physically, but emotionally. After years of distance, silence, and unspoken pain, he had planned everything down to the smallest detail: the flight, the gifts, the quiet dinner at the old Brentwood house. In his mind, this wasn't just a holiday visit. It was a reset, a moment where everything broken inside his family might finally slow down and begin to heal. He imagined sitting across from his parents again, hearing familiar laughter, feeling, even briefly, like a son who belonged. But on the night of December 14th, all of that vanished in a single phone call. What Jake heard on the other end of the line didn't just change his plans, it shattered the foundation of his entire life. His parents were gone. The words didn't arrive gently, they came fast, heavy, and unreal, like a sentence spoken in a language his mind refused to understand. There was no warning, no time to prepare, just shock crashing into disbelief, followed by a silence so loud it felt physical. And then came the name, a name Jake never imagined hearing in this way: Nick, his younger brother, the boy he had protected since childhood, the one he had defended, covered for, and worried about for years. In that instant, grief collided with something darker: confusion, anger, a fear Jake had carried quietly for a long time suddenly rising to the surface. Because deep down, this wasn't just a tragedy. It was a nightmare Jake believed he had already seen coming. Days later, when Jake appeared on KCBS, the studio fell into a rare, uncomfortable silence. His voice was low, controlled, but underneath it trembled something raw and exhausted. "I warned my parents beforehand," he said. "I was afraid that one day he would do something that couldn't be undone." That single sentence froze the room. It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't revenge. It was the collapse of a belief Jake had carried for years. The belief that love alone could fix everything. And as he continued speaking, it became clear this story wasn't about one night. It was about years of silence, favoritism, fear, and warnings that went unheard. This was not just a son grieving his parents. This was a brother confronting a truth he had been afraid to say out loud, and this was only the beginning. From the outside, growing up with the Reiner name looked warm, creative, and almost magical. Jake Reiner was born in May 1991 in Los Angeles, the eldest son of filmmaker Rob Reiner and photographer Michelle Singer Reiner. Laughter, storytelling, and classic films filled the house. His grandfather, Carl Reiner, was a towering presence, not just in comedy, but in spirit. To most people, it looked like the perfect Hollywood childhood. But inside that home, roles formed quietly and early. Jake grew up alongside his younger sister Romy and his younger brother Nick. As the oldest, Jake learned something before he ever understood it. He learned how to step back. Nick was smaller, more fragile, always described as needing extra care. When tensions rose, eyes turned toward Nick. When Nick struggled, the entire household slowed down to protect him. And without anyone saying it directly, Jake absorbed the message. Be patient, be quiet, don't make things harder. He gave up toys without arguing. He gave up rooms without complaint. He gave up explanations he deserved but never received. "He's still little," Jake heard again and again. Each time he nodded, swallowing emotions he didn't yet have words for. Being the older brother slowly became an exercise in endurance. Jake began to believe that love meant staying silent, that loyalty meant adjusting yourself until there was nothing left to adjust. When Nick lost his temper, everything stopped until he calmed down. When Nick cried, attention shifted instantly. Jake learned how to comfort himself quietly, often in corners no one noticed. "I'm fine," he said often. No one ever asked if that was true. Over time, that habit turned into something dangerous. It became a way of erasing himself. Jake didn't disappear all at once. He faded slowly, piece by piece, learning how to be the child who never caused trouble. Rob and Michelle loved Nick fiercely, not recklessly, but fearfully. They loved him with the anxiety parents feel when they believe a child might slip away if they loosen their grip even slightly. They protected him. They defended him. They believed patience would eventually solve everything. Jake never blamed them for that love, but he did feel the distance forming. He remembered his father laughing off Nick's outbursts, trying to keep the atmosphere light. He remembered his mother pulling Nick close, whispering that he was just having a hard time. Jake stood beside them, understanding their intentions, while quietly realizing that his own needs had learned how to stay invisible. "I'm used to it," Jake once said to his mother, half joking, half pleading. She smiled, never realizing those words were an almost silent cry for help. As Jake grew older, that role hardened inside him. He became observant, reserved, always reading the room before speaking, always adjusting himself so no one else had to. And long before tragedy struck, Jake already felt like the house wasn't really a home anymore. It was a place where everyone was surviving, and the real danger hadn't even arrived yet. Jake's teenage years became tied to baseball. It wasn't just a hobby, it was a language between father and son, a tradition passed down like something sacred. Rob would take Jake to Dodger Stadium again and again, sitting beside him through long games under the California sun, sharing the kind of quiet closeness that didn't need many words. Those nights felt normal, safe. In those moments, Jake could almost believe his family was like everyone else. He could almost forget the tension, waiting back at home, almost forget the feeling of always adjusting, always stepping aside. Rob spoke with pride about those years, about passing his love of baseball down to Jake, about trips to the Hall of Fame in Cooperstown, moments that even made him emotional. To Jake, baseball was a rare place where he didn't have to disappear. But even in that warmth, Nick's presence hovered over everything. Because while Jake was growing into himself, Nick was beginning to slip away. When Nick was around 15, the struggle began. At first, it didn't look like a disaster. It looked like little changes that were easy to explain away. Distant eyes, sudden anger, nights when he vanished without warning, moods that turned sharp without reason. Jake remembers watching his brother and thinking he's asking for help. But the cry for help didn't stay small. What it started as subtle warning signs grew into a pattern the family could no longer ignore. Year after year, Nick moved from a school to treatment centers, then back again. Every time he returned, the family reset their hope like a fragile candle relit in the wind. Nick would sit at the dinner table, hands trembling slightly, voice low, promising, "I'll be okay this time, for real." Rob would nod, choosing belief because the alternative was unbearable. Michelle would hold Nick's hand, clinging to the idea that love could outlast anything, and Jake stood beside them, wanting to believe too. But he was also afraid because he had already believed too many times before. for Jake, the deepest pain wasn't only watching his brother struggle, it was watching his parents slowly wear down with every cycle. He saw the toll on Rob, the way worry seemed to bend his shoulders lower each year, as if time itself had started moving heavier inside their walls. He saw it in Michelle, too. She lived in a state of constant waiting, waiting for the phone to ring, waiting for news, waiting for proof that Nick was still holding on. Every pause felt like a threat. Jake once overheard his mother speaking softly in the kitchen, her voice shaking as if she didn't even want the walls to hear her fear. As long as he is still breathing, I won't give up. That sentence burned into Jake's memory, not because it was wrong, but because it revealed the truth. Their home was no longer living. It was surviving. There were nights Nick came back completely out of control. Jake watched as his father stepped between the brothers without thinking, acting like a shield on instinct. Behind closed doors, Michelle cried quietly, careful not to let Nick see her fall apart. That was when Jake realized something terrifying. The house wasn't a home anymore. It was a pressure zone filled with unspoken fear. Rob would say, "We have to save him," and Jake would hear a different question rising inside his chest, a question he never wanted to ask because he already feared the answer. Who was going to save the people doing all the saving? As the years passed, Jake learned to observe more than he was spoke. He became the quiet one, the careful one, the one who could read a room in seconds and adjust before anyone else even noticed tension building. Slowly, the idea of leaving home took shape, not out of rebellion, but out of survival. He feared fame. He feared living under bright lights while carrying a family story he could never explain without breaking someone's heart. Sometimes, standing backstage and watching others chase attention, he wondered if he belonged there at all. What if this path isn't mine? That question followed him for years. Even with the respected Reiner surname, Jake didn't rush into acting like people expected. Instead, he chose distance. He chose something that felt honest, grounded, and far from the emotional storm at home. He enrolled at Syracuse University and majored in broadcast journalism. And for the first time, he felt something click into place. He once said he only had one other passion, a passion for news. It was his way of defining himself beyond his father's shadow, a way to build something that belonged to him alone. And after graduating, he didn't take shortcuts. He started small. He worked at local stations, earning trust the slow way, the hard way. Later, he moved to KPRC Channel 2 in Houston from 2016 to 2018. Colleagues respected him for his professionalism and calm presence, especially during serious coverage. Step by step, his career grew. He became a steady voice people could rely on night after night. But when the camera lights shut off, the quiet returned. And in that quiet, the emptiness he'd carried for years still lived inside him. During his time in Houston and later at KCBS and KCAL in Los Angeles, Jake lived the full life of a working reporter. Long nights, breaking stories, cold scenes, difficult interviews. He delivered everything with restraint and control, the way he had learned to live since childhood. He didn't reject his family legacy. He just kept it at a distance. Baseball stayed with him too. That thread never broke. Jake co-hosted a podcast called Incline Dodgers, talking baseball with humor and heart, keeping the tradition alive in his own way, on his own terms. And whenever he spoke about KCBS, something shifted in his posture, like the studio still gave him a solid ground. He remembered all the nights he'd sat through other people's tragedies, reporting with calm professionalism. And he once admitted something that sounded almost like a confession. I chose journalism because I thought if I stood behind the story, then life wouldn't call my name. He gave a faint smile when he said it, the kind of smile that didn't reach the eyes. And then he added quietly, I was wrong. Because even when you stand behind the story, life still finds you. Not long after, Jake returned to acting, not like an heir chasing fame, but like someone stepping into the spotlight late, carrying hesitation, nerves, and lived experience. Roles came slowly: television, film, comedy, drama. Jake didn't enter scenes loudly, he didn't force attention. Instead, he carried a quiet weight that lingered after the scene ended. People began to notice something different. This wasn't just Rob Reiner's son. This was an actor with his own rhythm, his own sadness, his own restraint. By 2023, he appeared in projects like Curb Your Enthusiasm for All Mankind and American Crime Story, building credibility one role at a time. But the project that truly shifted perception was an independent film called Love and Tax. In that film, Jake took on a leading role that demanded vulnerability and control. And in 2024, that performance earned him Best Actor at the Myrtle Beach International Film Festival. It should have felt like a breakthrough moment, but the truth, Jake later revealed, was heartbreaking, because the proudest moments of his career didn't feel complete. Between takes, when the noise faded, his thoughts drifted back to his parents. Every time he stood before the camera, he felt like he wasn't just performing for directors or audiences. He was performing for the two people who had watched over him his entire life. In his mind, Rob appeared just behind the set, arms crossed, serious expression, but eyes filled with pride. Michelle appeared softer, observing quietly, as if capturing every moment with an invisible camera only she could see. Jake would call home and try to keep his voice calm while his heart raced. He'd talk about auditions, new roles, and that first independent film he landed after competing with thousands. I did it, he'd say, half joking, half pleading. Rob would pause in that familiar way, then reply simply, I knew you would. Michelle would laugh, her voice trembling with emotion. I always knew you would find your place. Jake held on to those words like oxygen. He sent behind the scenes photos, articles, short videos recorded on his phone. Michelle replied with long messages full of warmth. Rob stayed brief, direct, but Jake understood those words carried pride that didn't need decoration. You're on the right path, his father once wrote. Jake reread that sentence more times than he could count. And as Christmas approached, Jake held on to one belief: he would finally come home. After years of distance, silence, and busyness, he planned the reunion like it was a sacred thing. He pictured sitting in the old living room, bringing his achievements like late gifts, Rob nodding slowly, Michelle squeezing his hand. He imagined stepping through the door and finally saying what he'd been trying to say for years: I'm home. He truly believed that moment would erase the distance and dissolve the misunderstandings. He believed Christmas would finally feel whole again. And then, without warning, everything shattered. Jake was in New York when the news arrived. He had just finished work on a film. Nothing about the day felt unusual. His phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, expecting something ordinary. Instead, the moment he answered, time seemed to break apart. The voice on the other end didn't ease him in. There was no careful build-up, no gentle preparation. His parents were gone. The words didn't register at first. Jake didn't scream. He didn't collapse. He stood frozen, as if his body had shut down to protect him from what his mind couldn't yet absorb. Rob and Michelle, the two people who had anchored his entire life through every storm, gone before he could even catch his breath. Before shock had time to turn into grief, another sentence followed. Nick had been named as the suspect. That was the moment everything inside Jake fractured. The brother he had protected since childhood. The boy he had defended, worried over, warned others about. Suddenly, Nick's name wasn't attached to struggle or addiction anymore. It was attached to something unthinkable. Christmas instantly lost all meaning. There would be no reunion, no old living room, no late gifts laid out with nervous pride. 2 chairs at the table would remain permanently empty. Jake flew back to Los Angeles almost on instinct. The city he knew so well felt foreign, cold, stripped of its familiar glow. When he reunited with his sister Romy, the two barely spoke. Words felt useless. They held on to each other and cried, trying to grasp whatever warmth their family still had left. Later, they would describe the pain as unbearable. At first, grief dominated everything, but grief didn't stay alone for long. Anger arrived, and when it came with force. Jake began saying out loud what he had carried quietly for years, truths that made people uncomfortable, warnings that had once been dismissed. On air, his voice shook, but his words were precise. I warned them, he said, not out of rage, out of devastation. He explained that 3 months earlier, he had reached out to his parents in fear. Nick had been struggling deeply. There was talk of him moving back home. Jake panicked, not because he hated his brother, but because he had seen the warning signs too many times. Please don't let him move back in, Jake told them. I'm scared something irreversible could happen. Those weren't accusations, they were pleas. He begged his parents to set boundaries, to protect themselves, to take things slowly, if not for him, then for themselves. But Rob and Michelle responded the way they always had, with hope, with forgiveness, with love that believed it could still fix everything. Rob's voice echoed in Jake's memory later, calm and steady. Nick is your brother, he had said. He's trying to change. We're family. Michelle promised they would supervise, that everything would be handled, that love would be enough. Jake tried one last time to push back. He spoke about Nick's violent outbursts, about the darkness addiction had planted deep inside him. But compassion won again. And now the unthinkable had happened. I never thought he could do something like this, Jake admitted later, his voice breaking completely. Viewers watching struggled to breathe through their own tears. At first, Jake's grief transformed into fury. Fury aimed straight at Nick, the brother he had once loved without hesitation. Nick killed our parents, Jake said. I warned them, and no one listened. But rage doesn't stay solid forever. It collapsed inward, turning into something heavier. Guilt. Jake began replaying every moment, every phone call, every warning, every silence. Should I have flown home sooner? Should I have pushed harder? Should I have screamed instead of pleading? The questions tortured him because none of them had answers. He's my brother, Jake said quietly later, torn apart by contradiction. But he's also the person who took my parents away from me. That was the moment his body finally gave in. His shoulders folded inward. His hands trembled. Tears fell without sound, like years of swallowed pain finally breaking loose. And then, as if fate wanted to twist the knife one last time, Jake's phone rang. Nick. Jake stared at his phone for a long time before answering. He already knew who it was. His stomach tightened, his chest felt heavy, and for a brief moment he considered letting it ring, not out of cruelty, not out of anger, but because he knew that once he picked up, there would be no way back to the person he had been just minutes before. When he finally answered, Nick's voice came fast and frantic, as if he was afraid even a second of silence would make Jake hang up. He talked without stopping. He said everything had just spiraled, that things went wrong, that people didn't understand, that he hadn't done what everyone was saying. His voice cracked, shaking between fear and desperation. "Please believe me," Nick said. "You're the only one I have left." Jake closed his eyes. That voice once belonged to a little boy he had protected his entire life, the same boy he used to give up toys for, the same boy he learned to stay quiet for, the same boy he had warned everyone about, not out of hate, but out of fear. Then Nick said the number, $4 million. That was the amount needed for bail. The number dropped between them like a final lifeline. Nick begged Jake to help, to use money, to use connections, to do anything he could to pull him out. "I can't survive in here," Nick said, almost crying. "Just help me this once, please." Every word hit Jake straight in the chest, where brotherly loyalty and unbearable grief collided head on. He stayed silent for a long time, long enough to hear his own breathing, uneven and heavy, like someone standing on the edge of two cliffs with nowhere left to step. In his mind, two faces appeared. Rob, Michelle, the two people who would never get another chance to be saved. "Nick," Jake finally said, his voice low, exhausted, stripped of everything but truth. "I can't." The words fell slowly, but they carried the weight of a stone. "I can't use money to run from the truth." Nick exploded on the other end of the line. Anger and panic tangled together. He accused Jake of betraying him, of abandoning him, of choosing the world over his own blood. Jake squeezed his eyes shut as tears spilled freely. "I'm not abandoning you," he said, his voice shaking, "but I can't save you this way either." It wasn't a decision made with logic. It was the last boundary Jake had left, and it came far too late, at a cost that cut deeper than anything he had ever known. The call ended in uneven breathing, then silence. Jake stared at the dark screen of his phone, feeling like he had just severed the final thread tying him to his brother. He didn't know if Nick understood. He didn't know if the decision was right or wrong. All he knew was one brutal truth. Sometimes love is not enough to save someone, and realizing that might be the cruelest punishment of all. When the broadcast ended on the night of December 17th, something unusual happened. People didn't rush to change the channel. Living rooms stayed quiet. Remote controls lay untouched. It felt as if standing up or speaking would somehow shatter the weight of what had just been witnessed. This wasn't a typical news segment. There were no raised voices, no dramatic confrontations, no sensational headlines flashing across the screen. Instead, there was silence, the kind that sits heavy in the chest. Viewers didn't see a polished reporter that night. They saw a son unraveling in real time, someone whose pain wasn't packaged for ratings, but spilled out slowly, uncontrollably, and without defense. Messages began to appear almost immediately. "I couldn't breathe after watching this." I've never seen something so painful on the news. He wasn't a reporter tonight. He was just a son. Some people admitted they turned the TV off halfway through, only to turn it back on minutes later. It felt wrong to watch, but it felt even worse to walk away, like witnessing something deeply private that no one should ever have to endure publicly. Online, the reaction split in two directions. On one side was grief for Rob Reiner, a man whose films had filled decades with laughter, warmth, and meaning. His legacy suddenly felt overshadowed, a tragedy too cruel to process. On the other side was heartbreak for Jake and his sister Romy. They didn't just lose their parents, one comment read, drawing thousands of reactions. They lost the very idea of family. That sentence lingered. People hugged their loved ones tighter that night. They called siblings, parents, friends, just to hear a familiar voice. Jake's story stopped being only his own. It touched a fear many people carry quietly, but rarely say out loud, that everything can fall apart inside the place we believe is safest. In the days that followed, Jake struggled deeply. Sleep brought no rest. His mind replayed warnings, conversations, moments that could never be undone. The anger didn't fade. It burned alongside grief, fueled by the same question that refused to leave him alone. 3 months, just 3 months earlier, he had said everything he could. He had warned them. He had begged them to be careful. And now that timeline haunted him endlessly. From the outside, Jake Reiner's life once looked stable, a respected family name, a growing career, a voice of his own. But when everything was stripped away, what remained was a man shaped by years of silence, ignored warnings, and a tragedy born from within his own bloodline. He didn't just lose his parents in one devastating moment. He lost the belief that love alone is always enough. Speaking out was never about attention. It was a final attempt to turn unbearable pain into a warning for others, a reminder that families need more than hope. They need boundaries, they need listening, they need the courage to act when danger appears. Some mistakes don't offer second chances. Some Christmases never come again.